The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink as Elizabeth Morgan stood on the wooden porch of her modest ranch house, gazing out at the rolling hills of Wyoming Territory. The year was 1878, and the scars of her past were still fresh, though hidden beneath the calm exterior she presented to the world. At 42, Elizabeth had rebuilt her life from the ashes of tragedy. A husband lost to violence 5 years earlier, a ranch nearly stolen by unscrupulous men, and a heart she'd locked away for safekeeping. Her chestnut hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was pulled back in a practical bun, and her blue eyes, once bright with youth and hope, now carried the weathered wisdom of one who had seen too much of life's cruelty. She ran her calloused hands along the porch railing, feeling the rough wood beneath her fingertips, a reminder of the hard work that had kept her mind occupied and her grief at bay. "Miss Lizzie," called young Thomas, her ranch hand's son, running up the dirt path, dust kicking up behind his boots. "Rider coming. Looks like that new marshal from town." The boy's excitement was palpable, his freckled face flushed with the importance of delivering this news. Elizabeth nodded her thanks, squinting at the horizon where a lone figure on horseback approached along the winding trail that led to her property. She straightened her simple dress and took a deep breath, wondering what business the law had with her quiet ranch. The last time a lawman had come calling, it had been to deliver news that had shattered her world. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know what city you're watching from. The rider drew closer, and Elizabeth could make out the glint of a silver star on his chest, catching the dying sunlight. Marshal Daniel Blackwood was a newcomer to the town of Cottonwood Springs, having arrived just 3 weeks prior with little fanfare and even less personal history. Folks said he'd been a respected lawman in Colorado before something drove him west. But Daniel kept his past close to his vest. At 48, his face was weathered by sun and experience, with deep lines etched around eyes that missed very little. His salt and pepper hair and neatly trimmed beard gave him a distinguished appearance that commanded respect without demanding it. Elizabeth had seen him only twice in town, noting how he moved with the careful precision of a man accustomed to trouble, always watching, always ready. As Daniel dismounted his chestnut gelding, Elizabeth noticed he wasn't wearing his usual stern expression. Instead, he removed his hat respectfully, revealing hair still damp with sweat from the day's heat. "Evening, Mrs. Morgan," he called, his voice deep but gentle, like distant thunder that threatened no storm. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." Elizabeth descended the porch steps, maintaining a careful distance between them as protocol and caution dictated. "It's Miss Morgan, Marshal," she corrected, not unkindly, "and that depends entirely on why you're here." A slight smile touched the corners of Daniel's mouth as he appreciated her forthright manner, so different from the polite deference he usually encountered. "Fair enough," he replied, tying his horse to the hitching post. "I'm here about your complaint regarding water rights on the North Creek." He reached into his saddlebag and produced an official-looking document. "The territorial judge has ruled in your favor against the Cumberland Mining Company. They've been ordered to remove their dam and pay damages for the water they've diverted." Elizabeth's eyes widened slightly. She had filed the complaint months ago, but had little hope of justice against such a powerful company. Something in her expression must have betrayed her surprise, because Daniel added, "I may be new here, Miss Morgan, but I believe in the law protecting everyone equally, not just those with deep pockets." The shadows lengthened across the yard as they discussed the details, and Elizabeth found herself inviting the marshal to stay for supper, a courtesy she would extend to anyone who had ridden so far with good news, she told herself, ignoring the curious flutter in her chest when he accepted with a gracious nod. Inside her kitchen, the familiar routines of cooking helped calm her unexpected nervousness as she prepared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread. Daniel offered to help, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked with old scars that told stories he didn't volunteer. They worked in companionable silence, moving around each other with an ease that surprised them both, as if they'd shared this space for years rather than minutes. Over supper, conversation flowed more naturally than Elizabeth had anticipated. Daniel spoke of his 20 years upholding the law across the territories, sharing amusing anecdotes but carefully avoiding anything too personal. Elizabeth found herself smiling more than she had in recent memory, drawn to his understated humor and thoughtful observations. As darkness fell completely, Daniel lit the oil lamps, their golden glow creating an intimate circle that seemed to exclude the rest of the world. "You've done something remarkable here," he said, gesturing to encompass the ranch. "Most men couldn't have held on to a spread like this alone, let alone improved it the way you have." The genuine respect in his voice warmed Elizabeth more than the stew had. "Necessity's a powerful motivator, Marshal," she replied, her fingers absently tracing the wood grain of the table. "After James was killed, I had a choice to make. Leave everything we'd built together or learn to be both husband and wife to this land." The words had slipped out before she could catch them, and Elizabeth fell silent, surprised at herself for mentioning James so casually to a virtual stranger. Daniel didn't press, simply nodding his understanding. "Some choices are made for us," he said quietly. "It's what we do after that reveals who we truly are." The simplicity of his response, free from pity or platitudes, loosened something tight in Elizabeth's chest. As the evening drew to a close, Daniel stood reluctantly reaching for his hat. "I should be getting back to town," he said, though his eyes suggested he'd rather stay. "Thank you for the meal and the company." Elizabeth walked him to the door, suddenly aware of his height and breadth as he stood close to her in the narrow hallway. "You're welcome to come by again, Marshal," she offered, surprising herself once more. "Perhaps next time it won't require a legal victory." A genuine smile transformed Daniel's serious face, reaching all the way to his gray eyes and making him look years younger. "I'd like that very much, Miss Morgan," he replied, placing his hat on his head with a slight tip in her direction before stepping into the night. Over the following weeks, Daniel found reasons to ride out to the Morgan Ranch, sometimes with legitimate business, sometimes with thinly veiled excuses that Elizabeth pretended to believe for both their sakes. Each visit lasted longer than the one before, and Elizabeth began to anticipate the sight of him riding up her trail, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the big Wyoming sky. They fell into an easy friendship, sharing meals and conversation, carefully circling the growing attraction between them without acknowledgement. Daniel helped with repairs around the ranch, working alongside her regular hands, without any hint that he considered such labor beneath his position. Elizabeth found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, noting the gentle way he handled frightened horses, the patience he showed young Thomas when teaching him to whittle, and the respect he showed to everyone, regardless of their station. One late afternoon in early autumn, they rode together to check on a section of fence line damaged in a recent storm. The air was crisp with the promise of the coming winter, and the land stretched around them in a patchwork of gold and bronze. They rode in comfortable silence, side by side, until they reached a ridge overlooking a valley ablaze with aspen trees in their full golden glory. Daniel reined his horse to a stop, and Elizabeth followed suit, both of them taking in the breathtaking vista. "I never tire of this view," Elizabeth said softly. "No matter how hard life gets, the beauty of this land reminds me why I fought to keep it." Daniel's eyes were on her profile rather than the scenery, as he replied, "Some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." Elizabeth turned to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, neither spoke, the connection between them almost palpable in the clear mountain air. Then Daniel looked away, clearing his throat. "I should tell you something, Elizabeth," he said, using her given name for the first time. "Before rumors reach you from other sources." His tone had grown serious, and Elizabeth felt a flutter of apprehension. "I wasn't always a marshal," he continued, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a daughter in Colorado. They were killed during a bank robbery I was trying to stop." The pain in his voice was raw, despite the passage of time. "I couldn't save them, and for a while after, I wasn't fit to wear the badge. I came here looking for a fresh start, same as many others." The revelation hung in the air between them as Elizabeth absorbed his words, understanding now the shadows she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. Without thinking, she reached across the space between their horses and laid her hand on his arm. "Thank you for trusting me with that," she said simply. Daniel covered her hand with his own, rough and warm against her skin. "I wanted you to know," he replied, "because I find myself thinking of you as more than just a friend, Elizabeth. And that terrifies me almost as much as I suspect it terrifies you." The honesty in his admission stripped away the last of her defenses, leaving Elizabeth feeling both vulnerable and strangely liberated. They remained that way for a long moment, connected by touch and shared pain. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, the return journey was quieter, both lost in thought as they considered the threshold they stood upon. At the ranch house, Daniel helped Elizabeth dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Daniel hesitated, then shook his head, regretfully. "Not tonight," he said. "I think we both need time to consider what lies ahead." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture from another time that made Elizabeth's heart race like a girl's. "I'll come back tomorrow, if that's all right with you." She nodded, unable to find words as he mounted his horse and rode away, the setting sun turning him into a silhouette that she watched until he disappeared from sight. That night, Elizabeth sat by her window long after darkness had fallen, examining feelings she had buried so deeply she had almost forgotten they existed. The possibility of loving again, of being vulnerable to loss again, filled her with both yearning and dread. The ranch had been her sanctuary and her purpose, but for the first time in 5 years, she allowed herself to imagine sharing it with someone else. Daniel's admission of his own fears had touched her deeply, making her realize that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite it. As the moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across her land, Elizabeth came to a decision that both frightened and exhilarated her. True to his word, Daniel returned the next day, arriving as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the yard. Elizabeth had been watching for him from the corral, where she was working with a young colt. She abandoned her task when she saw him approaching, her heart performing that now familiar quickening as he dismounted and walked toward her with purposeful strides. They stood facing each other beside the corral fence, the air between them charged with unspoken words. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Elizabeth began, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite the vulnerability it required. "About being more than friends." Daniel nodded, his expression carefully neutral as he waited for her to continue, giving her the space to find her words. "I buried more than my husband 5 years ago," Elizabeth confessed, her voice low and steady despite the emotion behind it. "I buried the part of me that knew how to love, how to trust that happiness won't be snatched away without warning." She took a deep breath, the next words among the hardest she'd ever spoken. "I'm afraid to love again, Daniel." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Daniel moved closer, gently taking her work-roughened hands in his own. His gray eyes held understanding rather than pity as he replied, "Then I'll teach you slowly, with my heart." The simple promise, offered without demands or pressure, brought unexpected tears to Elizabeth's eyes. "We both know loss," he continued softly. "We both know there are no guarantees, but I think we might be stronger together than we are apart." Elizabeth felt something shift inside her, like ice breaking on a river after a long winter. Painful, but necessary for new life to begin. "I'd like to try," she whispered, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Daniel's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, transforming his weathered face with a joy that reached his eyes and ignited an answering warmth in Elizabeth's chest. With deliberate tenderness, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, a benediction rather than a demand. "We'll take it one day at a time," he murmured against her skin, "and see where the trail leads us." Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaning into his touch and allowing herself, just for this moment, to believe in possibilities she had long since abandoned. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of rediscovery for both of them. Daniel became a regular presence at the Morgan Ranch, helping with the autumn harvest and preparations for winter. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Nothing escaped attention in a small community like Cottonwood Springs, but the general consensus was approval. Marshall Blackwood had proven himself to be fair and effective, and Miss Morgan had been alone too long. They made a handsome couple, folks agreed, both of them shaped by hardship but not broken by it. Neither Elizabeth nor Daniel paid much attention to the gossip, too absorbed in the careful unfolding of their relationship to concern themselves with outside opinions. They shared meals and conversations, gradually revealing the layers of themselves they had kept hidden for so long. Daniel's official duties often took him away from the ranch, but he returned whenever possible, sometimes riding through darkness just to spend an hour in Elizabeth's company before heading back to town. Elizabeth found herself watching the trail for his approach, anticipation she hadn't felt in years warming her blood. They were cautious with physical affection, both aware of propriety and their own emotional scars. But each touch, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing a cup, a brief embrace at parting, built a bridge across the chasm of their previous loneliness. The first time Daniel kissed her properly, beneath the cottonwood tree by the creek, Elizabeth felt as though she were waking from a long sleep, her body remembering sensations she had believed lost forever. As winter settled over the land, blanketing the ranch in pristine white, Elizabeth and Daniel's bond deepened. On Christmas Eve, a blizzard howled outside while they sat before the fireplace in Elizabeth's parlor, sharing stories of holidays past. Daniel spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, of his daughter's delight in Christmas morning, of traditions he had thought he would never celebrate again. Elizabeth listened, no longer flinching from the mention of his previous family, understanding now that love didn't require forgetting, only making room for new memories alongside the treasured old ones. When Daniel presented her with a small, carved wooden box containing his mother's silver brooch, Elizabeth accepted it with hands that trembled only slightly, recognizing the significance of the gift and what it represented. "I know we're taking things slowly," Daniel said, his voice husky with emotion, as he closed her fingers around the box. "And I'm not asking for any promises tonight. But I want you to know that you've brought light back into my life, Elizabeth Morgan. A light I thought was extinguished for good." Elizabeth leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, their breath mingling in the space between them. "And you've taught me that my heart wasn't dead, just dormant," she replied, allowing the warmth of her feelings to show in her eyes and voice. Waiting for the right person to awaken it. The kiss they shared then was a promise neither was ready to voice, but both understood. Sealed by the crackling fire and witnessed by the ghosts of those they had loved and lost, who perhaps watched with approval from whatever peaceful place they now resided. Spring came early to Wyoming that year. The snow melting, the marshal had gradually moved many of his personal belongings to the ranch house, though he maintained his official residence in town to avoid scandal. Nobody was fooled, but the community tacitly approved of the arrangement, recognizing the healing that had taken place in both the stern lawman and the independent rancher woman. One warm evening in late April, they sat together on the porch swing that Daniel had built as a surprise for Elizabeth's birthday. Watching the sunset paint the sky in colors no artist could capture, "I've been offered a permanent position as federal marshal for the territory," Daniel said, breaking the companionable silence. "It would mean more responsibility, but also more stability." He turned to face Elizabeth, taking her hands in his. "Before I accept, I need to know your thoughts." Elizabeth studied their intertwined fingers, his large and scarred, hers smaller, but equally marked by work and experience. "Would it mean you'd be away more often?" she asked, the question revealing how accustomed she had become to his presence in her life. Daniel shook his head, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Actually, it would mean I could choose my home base, and I was thinking that this ranch is centrally located for the territory I'd be covering." The implication hung in the air between them, and Elizabeth felt her heart race with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Are you asking to move in permanently, Marshal Blackwood?" she questioned, a teasing note in her voice belying the seriousness of the moment. Daniel's smile deepened as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "I'm asking for considerably more than that, Miss Morgan," he replied, his tone light, but his eyes intense with emotion. "I'm asking if you'd consider becoming Mrs. Blackwood." The directness of the proposal was so characteristic of the man that Elizabeth felt a surge of affection, even as her breath caught in her throat. Daniel continued, his voice growing softer. "I know we've both loved before, and no one can replace those we've lost. But I believe we've been given a second chance at happiness, if you're willing to take that risk with me." Elizabeth looked out at the land she had fought so hard to keep, the ranch that had been both her prison and her salvation in the dark days after James's death. Then she turned back to Daniel, seeing in his weathered face everything she had never expected to find again: companionship, understanding, and a love that respected who she had been and who she had become. "Yes," she said simply, surprising herself with the lack of hesitation in her voice. "Yes, I'll marry you, Daniel." Joy transformed his expression as he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as though it had been waiting all along for this moment. "I can't promise it will always be easy," he said, pulling her gently into his arms. "But I can promise you won't face any of it alone, not ever again." As Daniel lowered his head to seal their engagement with a kiss, Elizabeth felt the last of her fear dissolve like morning mist under the rising sun. They had both walked through fire and emerged scarred but stronger, carrying their past losses not as burdens, but as parts of the whole that had brought them to this moment. The Wyoming sunset spread its golden light across the land, promising another day to follow, another chance to build the life they had found together. And as Elizabeth returned Daniel's kiss with all the passion of a heart reawakened, she silently thanked the twists of fate that had brought this man to her door and given her the courage to let him in. Standing at the altar in Cottonwood Springs Small Church 3 months later, Elizabeth and Daniel exchanged vows before a congregation that included nearly everyone in the county. Elizabeth wore a dress of deep blue rather than traditional white, acknowledging that this was not a first love, but perhaps a greater one for having been found after such loss. Daniel, resplendent in a new black suit, watched her with undisguised adoration as she walked toward him, his badge pinned to his chest glinting in the sunlight, streaming through the stained glass. When they joined hands before the minister, Daniel leaned close to whisper, "Still afraid?" Elizabeth smiled up at him, calm certainty in her heart where fear had once resided. "Not anymore," she replied softly. "You taught me well." As they rode away from the church amid cheers and well wishes, bound for the ranch that would now truly be their shared home, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them together. Two broken people who had found in each other not just healing, but strength, not just companionship, but passion, not just security, but adventure. The future stretched before them like the vast Wyoming sky, expansive, sometimes unpredictable, but always beautiful in its possibilities. And as Daniel reached across to take her hand, his wedding ring catching the light, Elizabeth knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together, their love hard-won, and therefore all the more precious. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.